data protection laws, infringements occur seldom in the West.
Yeah.
Like, you can't count them. Neither the company who's been collecting the data, neither the company who's been processing the data, they don't suffer.
Yeah.
The layman, the end user, the data
subject.
whose data is actually being used for all these purposes, he's the one suffering.
The CCPA has created a new category that is regulated by them called the data brokers, which are basically entities that use information of customers, take their consent and then sell it. And you know, at the end of the day, हम सोचते हैं कि हमारे जो Facebook पे ad आ रहा है, हमारा जो Instagram पे ad आ रहा है, वो पहले कल कोई और देख रहा था, मेरे साथ कोई बैठा हुआ था, वो ये देख रहा था, मेरे पे भी आ गया, मैं ये सोच रहा था, मेरे पे भी आ गया. Actually, the issue is that when you are going through or when you are feeding information into one social media website, that information being sold to another corporation. Hello and Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of TechTalk. My name is Mahad Abdullah Shahid and I am a compliance and legal associate at Programmers Force.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Syed Mohammad Mufaqir, and I too am a compliance and legal associate at Programmers Force.
So the topic we have up for discussion today is information capitalism and digital privacy. Before introducing the concept, I want to briefly go over the power of information. In 1987 in Moscow State University, Dmitry Davidov created a game known as Mafia, or also known as Werewolf, in which there are two groups. One group is an informed minority and one group is an ill-informed majority. The informed minority forms 2 out of 10 people of that group, and the ill-informed majority forms 8 out of 10 people of that entire group. There are rounds in which there are days and nights, and the one group has to eliminate the other group. My purpose of telling you this concept is that more often than not, the informed minority always wins the game. That's because that informed minority has much more power than the ill-informed majority, just by the very fact that they are aware of who the entire team is, who the villagers are, who the mafia is. But the villagers are unaware of who the mafia is. Just because of this small difference, it creates a huge impact. Which brings us to information capitalism or digital capitalism. What are your thoughts on information capitalism, Mufaqir?
Well, I feel as a layman, anybody who would hear the term information capitalism or digital capitalism, the first thing that would come to mind is simply how you can use information for the purposes of capitalism, which is either sell it or use it for your own gain. However, what a lot of people don't understand or refuse to understand in this modern day and age is that nothing is free. Information capitalism, although the companies profiting off of it are obviously increasing their revenue day by day, but the actual layman whose personal information is being sold for them for their personal gain, they in fact are not actually aware of that. So why don't you elaborate on how one can become more aware of the information that they hold and the possible capitalization opportunities they have?
Right. So just to further comment on what Mufaqir has just stated. So information is used by corporations for capital gains, and the information of the data subject is exploited to a very great extent. When we use social media applications or any other application that's free on the internet, we believe that it's free to use. But in fact, there is a price that we are paying. And that price is the fact that the information that we give to that corporation is being used and given to other agencies so that there are ads or there are specific products that are marketed to us to be sold. Our information, which we give freely, is used by these social media corporations to sell to other corporations to be used for their own gain, even though it's our information. It's so bad that at this point there practically exists a digital self of everyone who has used the internet, and they are not even aware of how much information exists of them on the internet. So the one way that one can be aware is through better knowledge of digital privacy and digital privacy laws. And I believe Mufaqir has something to say with regards to digital privacy law.
First of all, the digital privacy law landscape has greatly transformed within the past 10 years. A major reason for that being is that the main data protection regulation, which is the general data protection regulation enacted by the European Union, shortly known as the GDPR, That was enacted in 2016. It came into effect in 2018 in some EU states, but since then, a lot of countries within the EU, as a matter of law, have had to enact that, and a lot of countries outside the European Union as well. And the Middle East has also ushered in a new age of data protection regulations, which are very effective at dealing with the problems which arise, because a lot of these old laws don't really address the new aspects of digital capitalism. And a very big critique of digital data protection regulations is that the evolution of the technological sector is much more fast-paced than the regulatory evolution. So regulators are often falling short on how to address the proper problems which are ushered in by technology and especially AI with its new advent. So definitely data protection laws and digital capitalism have to go in hand if the rights of layman like you and I have to be protected.
Right.
So that's the crux of the data protection regulations.
Right. So with regards to the evolution of data privacy laws, I feel it's very important to compare how they evolved in different countries or across the world in different regions. So on the European side, privacy is a right in itself. Europeans or Asians are more focused on the right to privacy in itself. While in the Americas, the right is more about the freedom of information and the flow of information and freedom of speech. And it's more sectoral in its nature. So for example, if you look at the Americas, you will find laws like HIPAA, which is for basically the health sector. You will find laws like the COPA, which is for particularly for children's privacy rights, or you will find laws that are enacted in some states like the CCPA and some states that don't have laws. So it's very sectoral. Privacy is not seen as an essential part of everyday life. However, when it comes to the European side, it is mandated by the European Union that any state of the European Union has to abide by the GDPR. And another way we can look at this is through the opt-in and opt-out concepts. So in the European side or the Asian and European data protection regulations, you have the opt-in concept, basically, which is more stringent privacy rights, and you have to explicitly give consent or permission whenever you are being regulated by those laws.
For when it comes to may chime in for a second over here. Actually, the topic you were talking about, consent, I feel that that's a very, very important topic with regards to data protection regulations, primarily because of the fact that almost every data protection regulation stresses that consent should be free and informed.
Yes.
And what a lot of organizations that have to be compliant with these laws don't understand the actual meaning of free and informed consent. For example, if you're going on a website and there's a cookie policy which it's asking you to agree to, and you can't actually ascertain what data it will be tracking from that short extract that it displays to you. That's not informed consent.
Yeah, definitely.
And this is just an example. There are a lot of other examples of where free and informed consent is actually not being taken. It's either coerced or uninformed consent. And unfortunately, although these laws were enacted to specifically bridge this gap between the regulator and the layman, unfortunately, its operation isn't going as well as it was intended in the start.
Yes, definitely. And there's a huge discrepancy between these laws, right? So basically, some laws, when we talk about consent, so some laws specifically or explicitly ask for consent, while some laws basically state that consent exists, and if you want to opt out of the entire data protection or the entire data collection for that matter, then you can. And so that brings us to exactly what do data privacy laws entail. And there are some categories of data, which I believe Mufakir has something to say on.
All right, so basically, data protection laws, they classify personal data into two broad categories. The first category is personal data. The second category is personally identifiable information. Now, personally identifiable information carries a larger namesake with it because it includes any and all information from which you could be identified. It could be your phone number, your house address, a picture of your face, your biometrics, anything of that sort. Transmission and storing of that type of data is very, very strict. And then there's a third category introduced by laws, which doesn't apply to everybody, but it still has its applications in most sectors, which is the special categories of data, which include any special type of data, for example, racial profiling, information about a person's sexual orientation, their sex life, their trade union affiliations, anything of that sort, which can make an automated biased decision on them.
Yeah.
All of these are classified as special categories.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is that whereas most laws generally adopt the definitions of the GDPR, especially in the Middle East, there are laws of certain states which differ from these definitions of personally identifiable information. and strictly confidential data as well. So even that is somewhat of
There's a discrepancy.
There's a discrepancy. I would say there's a, like you were saying about the sectoral discrepancy within the United States. I would say there is a regional discrepancy as well. With some, for example, the Middle East is very, very stringent about how their data and how their residents' data is stored and kept, and how the consent has to be taken.
Yes,
Same things cannot be said about the laws on the West. For example, the CCPA or the HIPAA. HIPAA is actually a very niche act, but the GDPR, even the Swiss data protection law, they don't classify consent as much, as stringently as the Middle Eastern states do.
Regards to the exact nature of data privacy, I think it's important that in the regional analysis, the data privacy law framework, whatever is being used, it depends on the culture in which it has evolved.
Definitely, and I would add to this point that most of these laws, when promulgated in the West, they were promulgated to address the advent or the new creations or the new discoveries that were being made in the tech sector. People in the Middle East and in the Far East and in Southeast Asia as well, they've had to conform, or this is their response to the need for enacting such laws.
Enacting data privacy.
Because in the West, they were enacted when the need wasn't there as much as it is now. However, these countries have had to play sort of catch up, so necessarily they have had a little more strict and stringent provisions as well. Because, like you said, regional discrepancies exist, and definitely any lawmaker would naturally take into account the audience of that law or whoever that law is going to be affecting. So,
and that's really important when it comes to like how the law is evolving or how the entire market, economic market is evolving. When we're going towards things like artificial intelligence, when we're going towards things like automation and machine learning, this is really important. This discrepancy will create a lot of issues when there's transnational transactions.
To address this discrepancy, actually the first two parties to take a step in this direction are the US and the EU naturally. So basically, as I touched upon earlier, the EU has the general data protection regulations, and as you were touching that, in the United States does not have a federal data protection law. It has about 14 laws enacted by different states, and then HIPAA and COPA, which are federal laws, but no federal law directly addresses the issue of data protection. So while transferring, now the EU does, the GDPR does not allow cross-border data transfers. And cross-Atlantic data transfers are something which a lot of major tech companies like Amazon, Facebook, they had to do because of their headquarters in the United States. So to bridge this gap, the EU and the US, they came up with the data privacy framework. So companies in the US which want to receive data from the EU, they have to comply to this data privacy framework. Once they've complied, they are attested by an accreditor, and once that accreditor has attested that they are fully compliant to this service, then they are allowed to receive data directly from the EU, which essentially replaces the EU's normal safeguards for cross-border data transfers, which are SCCs and the binding corporate rules. So these gaps are being addressed, but they're not, like I said earlier, that the technological innovation is moving much faster than the regulatory innovation.
Exactly. They're not specifically tailored to every region either, right? So they're very across the board. They're very general in their nature, and there's a need for them to be more specific. So there's another thing that's important to discuss when it comes to data privacy laws, and that's the entities that are regulated by data privacy laws. Broadly, there are three entities: the data controllers, the data processors, and the data subjects. What do you have to say about that, Muhagir?
I feel that these categorizations are really important in today's data managing techniques, because they not only clearly delineate the functions of each of the parties, but they also afford equal rights and opportunities to both the data processor and the data controller. Because in effect, the data subject is a layman who will have no idea about what actually his rights are and under the data protection regulations. However, with the introduction of the roles as a controller and a processor, what happens is that their tasks get deleted into different categories, and the responsibilities that they have to enact. For example, the controller is usually directly responsible to the regulator. The processor is thereby responsible to the controller. The processor serves basically as an extension of the controller, and the controller is therefore responsible for all the inactions or actions of the processor. Now, what this simplifies for the end user or the data subject, as you classified it, is that now the data subject doesn't have to go to a separate data controller and a separate data processor, because he will be giving his data to the data controller, and that data will be dispersed by the controller to however many processors they have. So in an instance where the data subject wants the data deleted, what they will essentially do is they just have to go to one controller and they just have to tell them that this is my data and you have to delete them. उनके लिए अब वो वाली सारी चीज़ नहीं है कि where they have to go to different processes, ask for the data कि कौन कौन सा पड़ा हुआ है, and then have it deleted. All they have to do is just go to one controller जिसको उन्होंने data दिया था in the first place, and then that controller is going to direct all its processors and their sub-processors to actually give effect to whatever right that data subject is exercising. Now, to touch upon the rights the data subjects have, basically, like I said, most of these laws are modeled after the GDPR. So the GDPR afforded 4 main rights, which is the right of deletion, where you can have your data deleted from any database it is in. The right of rectification, where, for example, if there is some wrongful data entered against your name in a national inventory, you can have it corrected. Then there's a right to be forgotten, which essentially is an extension of the right to deletion. Okay. And then there is the right of access, where you are able to access whatever information a controller or a company may have on you. Obviously, there are exceptions where these rights do not apply. And on a first reading, these rights seem very absolute, but once you get a grip of the GDPR in detail, you realize that these rights are actually afforded, but the conditions that exclude them from actually being carried out, they are quite more, they're very plentiful, and they're more commonly engaged than you would actually think.
Yes. Like that could include contractual obligations, right?
Yeah, basically any statutory obligation on the controller to hold your data supersedes your right to have it deleted.
Right.
Any national security matter, whether it's being disclosed to you in clarity or not, it's a national security matter. Any data that they have on you is going to be, your right to have that deleted or even access it is going to be superseded.
Right. And you might think that since it's so straightforward, since there are very specific categories mentioned out and there's a very specific exceptions all throughout the GDPR and all throughout all the data privacy laws that have come to date, you would expect that a lot of companies would be able to comply with them. But to a lot of people's surprise, a lot of tech giants have been fined a large amount under such regulations. So like some of them, I could just touch upon them very briefly. In 2021, Amazon was fined 746 million euros by a French privacy advocacy group called La Quadrante du Net. And such other privacy groups or advocacy groups like None of Your Business, they are engaged in the process of finding out how big tech is using your data in an illegal manner as per data privacy regulations. Another such incident was with WhatsApp in 2021. Everyone, I believe half the globe uses WhatsApp at this point. And in 2021, they were fined 225 million euros. Google was fined 50 million euros in 2019. British Airways was fined 20 million pounds in 2020. So the list goes on, and there's a need for
this is actually one of the biggest arguments that people take against data protection as well, because these laws were brought in to curtail exactly these type of companies. You didn't mention Facebook. Facebook has been fined numerous amount of times in the hundreds and thousands of dollars. But such a big company, they can afford to pay it.
That's
so
true.
While the GDPR and all these other data protection regulations, while they do actually target enterprises or organizations which are not compliant with their provisions, the biggest fetter that a company has in the event of non-compliance is the fine. But companies who can pay the fine, like Facebook, Amazon, TikTok is a very big infringer of privacy rights as well. These companies, these laws, they don't matter to them, because what's the worst that could happen? They'll be fined and they'll just pay the fine. So this is a very big argument against the operation of these laws, that the exact purpose for which they were enacted isn't properly being fulfilled because of these companies' ability to pay these hefty fines time and time again.
Right.
Because they'll just revert back to their
usual practices.
Exactly. For example, Facebook introduced a very key change in its privacy policy back in June of this year. And they had given themselves extra permissions to extract your data and hold them. And any data protection law that you read will clearly depict that any information that you're extracting from the user, it should be easily accessible to the user. उसको पता होना चाहिए कि वो कौन सी information
जा रहा है, किस वजह से जा रहा है.
But they hate that change so skillfully in the depths of their privacy policy that, for example, I honestly believe that a layman would never even have wondered over there. And to be very specific, a person who is not well versed with the data protection regulations, or who is not well versed with how data is being collected, they will not think twice to check what data permissions they have given to anybody. There was an app back in 2018, 2019, a face app, which apparently if you uploaded a selfie to that app, it would age your face and tell you how you would look in 60s or your 70s.
Yeah.
And I believe a record of about 2.5 million people signed up to that app within one day. Now, what these people didn't realize was they were actually willfully giving away their selfies, so to say, but those selfies can become the basis for identity thefts.
Yeah.
They can become the cases for bank frauds, but they don't realize it because they don't see how the application can actually use that data and put it in a completely different purpose.
Yeah.
And they'll know nothing. They'll just be dumbfounded, and they won't even have anybody to go to because the regulations or the laws that are in effect right now, they don't address these kind of things. Once you've given consent for a certain purpose, you've given consent.
Right.
You can redact it, but if that person...
Up until you've given it, it's
exactly. अगर अगले को पता नहीं है वो किस चीज़ के लिए consent दे रहा है, तो उसकी consent जो है वो हर चीज़ के लिए इस्तेमाल की जा सकती है. बिल्कुल होती है.
कितनी बार होता है हम कुछ भी डाउनलोड करते हैं, उसकी प्राइवेसी पॉलिसी नहीं थी, TNCs नहीं देखते, टिक टिक करके हम कर लेते.
I don't think anybody has ever read the entire terms and conditions of any of either signing up for an email or downloading an app or registering with a bank. I don't think anybody ever reads the whole term. Not even us.
Yeah. I think being data privacy activists, even we don't.
Exactly. And we're supposed to be lawyers, so, we're supposed to read the fine print as well, but we don't read it as well.
We don't read it. Nobody does.
And the big corporations, they take full advantage of this because they know that you don't think that your data is actually worth anything. Whereas, just look at the Cambridge Analytica scandal, for example, entire data of the US residents was used to manipulate the elections. And all of this, over time, it's just going to get worse.
Yes.
The only way to make it get better is by implementing what you were talking about earlier, privacy by design.
By design.
So there's a big argument between big tech versus privacy, or big data or big tech with privacy.
Yeah.
So I believe that the privacy by design should be implemented at the very outset of these laws, and especially with all the parties that have to comply.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these laws have transnational application as well. For example, the GDPR, if you are sitting in any corner of the globe, but you're processing the data of an EU resident, the GDPR applies to you. Same with the Middle Eastern laws, same with the CCPA laws. CCPA laws actually are very specific to California residents. But regardless, these laws should address the exact need for which...
For their own residents, yeah.
Exactly, which was to curtail the data being collected and the users being ill-informed about what data is being collected.
Yeah.
Moreover, I also feel that data protection will greatly improve if people are actually informed about how their data can be used. Like I was giving that example of using a simple photograph for identity theft or bank fraud. There are a lot of other examples in this, some of which are not coming to my mind right now, but people should actually be educated about how simple picture of your loved ones or your own picture can be distorted, can be used to do extremely hurtful things, not just to you, but like things which can hurt the people around you as well.
I believe we're talking about deep fakes and all that technology.
Definitely. And AI is also a very big reason, which is completely... It's also a very, very big area which is completely unregulated.
It's unregulated or under-regulated.
Very few countries have actually enacted laws to about decentralized finance, crypto assets.
Yeah, definitely.
Very few countries have it. I believe UAE has one of the most prominent laws.
Yeah, then they have the VARA, which is the Virtual Asset Regulation Authority.
And they've actually done something very smart. They've brought this under the garb of regulation.
Yeah.
So up until to the enactment of these laws, all the transactions that are being carried out by crypto assets, they're not being regulated.
Yeah.
There's no tax on them. There's nothing on them. They're not even in the knowledge of the relevant regulators. But by enacting these laws and by bringing them within the centralized finance of a country, what you can actually do is you can actually tax them, you can actually control them, and all these instances of big amounts of money, of crypto exchanges crashing.
Right.
I believe they'll stop very soon because they'll know that they have regulators to answer to, and they are not the only ones making the rules for themselves.
Yeah, and there's the thing. The thing is that we always believe that we're always regulated or protected, but that's almost never the case when it comes to tech. So it's evolving at such a pace that regulation isn't catching up. So like when Mufaki talked about digital currencies or about cryptocurrencies, the fact of the matter is that these weren't regulated. They were used for anti-money laundering. And even though regulation is trying to catch up, it's better to regulate them rather than ban them outrightly.
Absolutely.
Because people will still do it. Anti-money laundering or money laundering will still occur. And, the misuse of all of these platforms will still occur. So it's better to regulate them. And sadly, Pakistan does not have a data protection law.
Very far behind as compared, not just as compared to the entire globe, but as compared to our neighbors as well.
Even our neighbors, yes.
India has a very, very impressive data protection
That's
law.
true.
Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, or even Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's the funny part.
Yeah, Afghanistan also has a data protection law, but however, Pakistan does have a data protection bill, but I don't think it's been passed.
It's been there for 4 years, but I hope this podcast reaches the right people.
A lot of people advocate that the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, PICA, that's just the purpose of the data protection law.
Yeah.
However, PICA generally just addresses crimes.
It's just about crimes. It's about
It
cyberbullying.
doesn't even touch upon the roles of the organizations that are involved in data processing, like the data controller and the data processor. So we lag really far behind, and I feel that we have a lot of neighbors that we should get inspired from. For example, UAE. Now the UAE has 3 data protection laws, and one is the federal law of the UAE, which applies to the entire
Entire
of the
region.
United Arab Emirates.
The DIFC.
Then there's a law for the DIFC data protection law, and then there's an Abu Dhabi Global Market data protection law. On top of these 3 laws, the Central Bank of UAE, it also has its own separate regulations regarding data transfers and data collection. So as a whole, that puts 4 regulations in one area, in one geographical location. And most of the people, when interacting with such organizations, they will have very little to very little to absolutely no idea about how their laws will be implemented on, or which law will they need to abide by. And I also feel that these regulations, or the purpose for which they were enacted, it's being carried out in a much more profound manner in these countries. For example, the data protection laws infringements occur seldom in the West. Like, you can't count them. The ones that are reported and the ones that are not reported, obviously you can't even begin to ascertain how many violations have there been. And what eventually happens is that neither the company who's been collecting the data, neither the company who's been processing the data, they don't suffer. The layman, the end user, the data subject, whose data is actually being used for all these purposes, he's the one suffering. He's the one who either gets all of his money stolen from his account, or he finds that he's purchased this and this in so and so country. So I believe what these laws should actually aim for is to find better ways to make their punishments more truthful, or more give them the ability to hinder organizations from carrying on these infringements and violations.
And just on that point, just because these infringements are occurring, and just because this law is being subverted, rather than just banning them outrightly, because you can't catch up to tech. So rather than just banning them outrightly, one thing that can be done is that it can be regulated. So, like, for example, the CCPA has created a new category that is regulated by them, called the data brokers, which are basically entities that use information of customers, take their consent, and then sell it, right? People willingly consent to their information being sold. And at the end of the day, हम सोचते हैं कि हमारे जो Facebook पे ad आ रहा है, हमारा जो Instagram पे ad आ रहा है, वो पहले कल कोई और देख रहा था, मेरे साथ कोई बैठा हुआ था, वो ये देख रहा था, मेरे पे भी आ गया, मैं ये सोच रहा था, मेरे पे भी आ गया. Actually, the issue is that when you are going through, or when you're feeding information into one social media website, that information being sold to another corporation. And when that information is being sold to another corporation, then you get tailored ads. There's an entire version of you जो exist करता है internet पे, जिसका हमें पता ही नहीं है.
So all this information that we're willfully putting out on these social media websites, they're actually an intelligence agency's dream. Because they're getting to map the entire diaspora of a country or of a region. They know what their likes, their interests are, what ticks them off, what pages do they follow, what politicians do they follow. So if you like the digital self that you were talking about earlier, I believe that that actually is much more specific than anybody could imagine. For example, like, we aren't any exception to it. If you have a smartphone in today's day and age, you definitely have a digital self, and that might even know you better than you know yourself.
You know yourself,
or at least, I'm sure, better than your friends or your family.
Or that corporation definitely knows you better than your friends and family.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that.
Yes, definitely.
And with the passage of time, I think that one thing that should increase is, like I was saying again, education. Like, people need to be educated on how their data can be used, how it's being collected from all the different sources. for example, banking apps collect data, social media apps collect data, simple weather apps collect data, they collect location data. And if I was to ask you to give me your location randomly, you might not, or you might ask me, what is it for? But you won't ask twice when an app is giving you a message to allow you to access your location.
Their location, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
what that does is, all of this, I believe, laws will play a very, very big role in addressing it.
Yeah.
But the main problem that is how people's data is being used against their wishes,
Yeah.
or not for the purpose that they intended for. This can only be curtailed if people are actually educated on the importance of maintaining proper control over the data that they are giving to somebody else. Because I believe, I don't remember the name of the journalist who said this, but he said that the Third World War will be fought over data.
Over data.
It's not going to be fought over any piece of land or any other asset. It's going to be fought over data.
Yeah.
And when I essentially heard this comment for the first time, I didn't see the ideology behind it. But when somebody does have data, they have everything that they need.
They have complete power over you, which brings us back to the very start of our discussion.
Digital
The power of information, the digital capitalism, this digital age and the information capitalism that comes with it. It's something that needs to be addressed. It's something that needs to be known by every data subject, anybody who's putting any kind of information on the internet. You need to know about your rights.
Because these companies, they're not going to do anything to
Yeah.
Part of their business model is extracting your data
Is the
and
exploitation.
selling it to the highest bid.
Yeah.
Like I was telling upon earlier, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where Facebook was sued for sending all the data of the US residents to Russia for the upcoming election. So that is just one example that came to light.
Yeah.
All the other examples which don't come to light, but people think that since they're not coming to light, they don't happen. Or this thing doesn't happen. Your data is being captured. You are being profiled, whether you like it or not. And the only way you can actually put a stop to it is if you're well versed with the privacy policy of whatever organization or whatever platform you're actually giving your information to. You should read that very carefully with regards to what permissions they're asking you, what data they're asking you. Because at the end of the day, the only person who's going to be responsible for this ignorance is going to be the data subject. So take extra good care of that.
And that should wrap up our discussion. Just as an ending note, please do read your privacy policies. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Tech Talk. I was Mahadullah Shahid, a compliance legal associate and your co-host, along with
Sayyid Mohammed Mufakhir. I do hope that this session is somewhat informative to your data protection rights. Signing off. Bye-bye.
Thank you.